The desert was dying for a little darkness. Out in the New Mexico territory, the sun doesn't set. It bleeds out, staining the horizon a deep, angry copper. The wind whispers through the sagebrush, and if you listen close, it always sounds like a warning. Chaza Red Elk stood on the porch of his isolated cabin, the wood groaning under his weight. In his hands, an old hatchet. His movements were calm, steady, as he pulled a sharpening stone across the blade. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was rhythmic, almost peaceful. But nothing was peaceful out here. Not anymore. His long black hair was braided tight, hanging over a shoulder stained dark with sweat. It was the autumn of '84 and the air was getting cool, but a different kind of heat was rising from the south. A heat he knew all too well. His horse let out a panicked snort from behind the barn. Chaza froze. His hand stopped moving. He listened. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a coyote. It was footsteps. Hurried, desperate, wrong. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as they scanned the shimmering heat haze that distorted the landscape. A shape was stumbling out of it. A small human shape, moving like it had already died once and was trying to outrun it a second time. Chaza rose slowly, the sharpening stone falling from his hand and landing silently in the dust. It was a woman. Her dress, what was left of it, was torn linen clinging to her frame. One shoulder was soaked through with blood. Some of it was old, dried to the color of rust, but some of it was fresh, glistening a terrible wet crimson in the dying light. She was clutching something to her chest, a dark wooden box, bound in strips of rawhide. Her hands were trembling so badly it looked like the box itself was alive, struggling to break free. Chaza didn't move a muscle. He just watched her, a hawk on a high branch, until she stumbled past the rotting gateposts that marked the edge of his land. "Get inside," he said. His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. "Before it's too late." She froze at the sound of his voice. Her head snapped up. Her eyes were green, wild with terror, and they locked onto his. She didn't run, but she didn't come any closer either. "I don't know you," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry kindling. Chaza stepped off the porch. The hatchet hung loose in his hand now, ready. "Name's Chaza Red Elk," he said, his voice flat. "I'm not gonna harm you, but you're not safe standing in the open." Her breath hitched. Her eyes darted back the way she came, scanning the empty horizon. But it wasn't empty. Far in the distance, a faint cloud of dust was rising. It was low, swirling in a way that wasn't natural. It was the kind of sign Chaza had seen 100 times before. The kind of sign that meant only one thing: pursuit. "They're coming," she breathed, the words barely audible. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Then you better move." She hesitated for just a second, a lifetime, then staggered towards the cabin, the box held tight against her chest. Chaza held the door open for her, and the moment she was inside, he shut it, the heavy wooden bolt sliding home with a deafening thud. The night was coming down fast now, like a loaded gun. The inside of the cabin was dim, smelling of cedar and old leather. He motioned to a chair by the hearth. She sank into it like her bones were made of glass, her eyes never leaving the bolted door. He poured a cup of water from a clay jug and handed it to her. Her hands shook so much the water sloshed over the tin rim. "Name?" he asked, his voice softer now. She took a long, shuddering swallow of water before she answered. "Ruth," she said. "Ruth Calderon." He nodded. "That's your blood on your shoulder? Or someone else's?" Her eyes dropped to the floor. "Both," she whispered. He studied her for a moment. She was pale, exhausted, her lips cracked from thirst. But there was something else in her eyes. Not just fear, defiance. "You need that wound cleaned," he said. She shook her head, fast. "No time. Not if they find us." He moved to the door and peered through a tiny notch he'd carved in the wood. The dust cloud was bigger now, closer. He could almost make out the shapes of riders. 5, maybe 6 of them, and they were moving fast. "Who are they?" he asked, his back still to her. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers traced the carvings on the wooden box. "They came to my town, Haven Crossing, 4 days ago," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "Said they were surveyors. Said the railroad was buying up the rights to the basin. Chaza turned to look at her, a cold knot tightening in his gut. What basin? Without a word, she opened the box. It wasn't filled with jewels or money. It was filled with paper. Old maps, leather-bound journals, letters tied with string. She pulled one of the maps out. This one, she said, her voice shaking again. El ojo del mundo, the eye of the world. He stepped closer. The map was hand-drawn, covered in notes and lines that spoke of water tables and geological pressure points. Chaza felt his stomach drop. That's an aquifer, he said. It wasn't a question. One of the largest in the territory, Ruth confirmed. My father, he was the town doctor. He knew what would happen if they drilled into it wrong. He said it could poison the land for 100 miles in every direction. Chaza stared at the map, then at the haunted look on her face. A name surfaced from a dark corner of his memory. Your father, he said slowly, Dr. Elias Calderon. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She nodded. They killed him, she whispered, burned his clinic to the ground, shot him when he ran back inside to save these records. Chaza's hand tightened on the hatchet. He remembered Dr. Calderon, a good man, a man who had treated Apache children when the army wanted them left to die. He glanced back through the peephole. The riders were close, way too close. You said they were surveyors, he said, his voice hard as iron. They were liars, she spat, her grief turning to rage. They're guns for hire. They work for a man named Reuben Lattimore, a former Union general who owns half the judges in Santa Fe. Chaza clenched his jaw. He knew that name. Lattimore. A name spoken in whispers. A name that brought a chill to the desert wind. And what you have in that box? He asked, nodding towards the maps. Proof, she said. Contracts. Letters between Lattimore and the territorial surveyor. Everything. He didn't need to hear any more. He turned, grabbed his Winchester rifle from its pegs on the wall, and started checking the rounds. The rhythmic click-clack of the lever action filled the small cabin. Where were you headed? He asked. Santa Fe, she replied. There's a journalist there, Clara Beck. She writes about the land thefts. My father was sending her information. The hoofbeats were loud now, a low thunder rolling across the plains. Ruth struggled to her feet, swaying. I have to keep going. I can't bring this to your door. Chaza stepped in front of her, blocking the way. It's already here. He pointed to a dark corner. You rest. We hold fast. She stared at him, her green eyes wide with confusion. Why? Why are you helping me? You don't know me. He glanced out the window one last time. The riders were cresting the last hill, dark silhouettes against the blood-red sky. He looked back at her. Because I know men like Lattimore, he said, his voice a low growl, and I know what they leave behind. He pulled a long, bone-handled knife from his belt and pressed it into her hand. If they get through that door, he said, his eyes locking with hers, you use this before they touch you. She took the knife, and in that moment, something shifted. The terror in her eyes was still there, but now it was mixed with steel. Outside, the first rider shouted. Chaza Red Elk whispered to himself, time to see if ghosts can still shoot. The fire didn't start with a match. It started with a lie written on fancy paper, stamped with an official seal, and delivered with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Ruth sat by the hearth, the wooden box open on her lap. Her hands moved over the papers inside, not with fear anymore, but with a kind of holy rage. They didn't wear masks, she began, her voice hollow. They wore suits. They promised our town progress, irrigation, a future. Chaza sat across from her, not speaking, just listening. The rhythmic scrape of him sharpening another blade was the only other sound. They called themselves the Water Syndicate, she continued, a pack of wolves dressed as businessmen, mining barons, land brokers, judges. They'd offer you pennies for your water rights, and if you refused, her voice trailed off. She pulled a letter from the box. The wax seal bearing the crest of the Santa Fe Territorial Court was broken. They offered Haven Crossing $5,000 for full access to the aquifer. We said no. Chaza raised an eyebrow. $5,000 is a lot of money for a small town. Ruth looked up, her eyes burning. It's not money when it's poison. Our elders remembered the last time outsiders came drilling. The wells went bad. The cattle died. The babies. The babies were born sick. Chaza nodded grimly. His own people had stories like that. Stories written in bone and buried in unmarked graves. 3 days after we refused, Ruth said, her voice dropping to a whisper, they came back, not with lawyers, with rifles. She took a shaky breath. It was just before dawn. They set fire to the grain stores first to draw the men out. Then they blocked the well. They shot my uncle when he tried to sound the alarm. Her voice cracked. They rounded everyone else up, forced them into the church, told them it was for their own protection. Then they barred the doors and lit the whole thing on fire. Chaza's hand stopped moving. The blade in his hand was still. His face was a mask of stone, but his jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. I was in the canyons, Ruth whispered, tears now streaming down her face, gathering herbs for my father's cough. That's the only reason. The only reason I'm alive. She pulled out another document, a surveyor's report. At the bottom was a signature, a confident, arrogant scrawl. Reuben Lattimore. This was their plan all along, she said. Total control of El Ojo del Mundo. Our town was just in the way. Chuzza stood and walked to a large map pinned to his wall. It was a map of the territory, crisscrossed with his own markings. His finger traced the faint blue lines of underground rivers, the veins of the earth. That aquifer, he muttered, his voice thick with a sudden, ancient anger. It fed my people long before the soldiers came, before the treaties that were nothing but lies. He turned to face her, his dark eyes blazing. They didn't just burn your town, Ruth. They've been burning everything for generations. She stared at him, seeing not just a stranger, but a fellow survivor, a man who understood the language of loss. I can't stop them, she said, her voice trembling, but I can expose them. That's what these papers are for. That's why I ran. He nodded slowly. And the man who gave the order? Lattimore? She hesitated. The men who chased me from Haven Crossing, one of them wore a Union officer's coat, a long gray beard, eyes as cold as a winter river. The others called him General. Chaz's eyes narrowed. Reuben Lattimore, he said. It wasn't a question this time. It was a curse. Ruth nodded. I saw him. He was the one who signed the paper. He was the one who watched it burn. The night outside was black and silent. But inside the small cabin, a fire had been lit. A fire of memory, of vengeance. And it was about to explode. Neither of them would sleep that night. They were waiting for the war to come to them. The first shot shattered the midnight stillness. It ripped through the corner of the cabin window, sending a spray of broken glass across the floor. Ruth hit the dirt, scrambling behind the heavy wooden table and clutching the box to her chest. Chaza was already moving. He was a shadow in the darkness, his rifle in his hand, his eyes scanning the night. Thwack! Another bullet slammed into the wall near the hearth, sending splinters flying. They're here, he muttered, stating the obvious. He moved fast, dousing the single oil lamp. The cabin plunged into an almost total darkness, a darkness that was suddenly their only friend. He moved by memory, gathering ammunition, 2 heavy revolvers, and the curved hatchet he favored for close work. The silence between the gunshots was terrifying. It was filled with the sound of their own breathing, the frantic pounding of their own hearts. Chaza pushed one of the revolvers into Ruth's hand. Know how to use one of these? She looked at the heavy weapon, then back at him. She nodded. My father taught me, she said, her voice tight. He said a woman in this territory needed to know how to do more than just bind wounds. Chaza gave a slight, appreciative nod. She checked the cylinder, her fingers surprisingly steady. A gust of wind hit the cabin, making the old wood creak and groan. But it wasn't the wind they were afraid of. How many? She whispered. Chaza peered through the notch in the door shutter. He saw a flicker of movement near the chicken coop. The silhouette of a man, rifle held at the ready. At least 5, he said. The same ones who chased you here. Ruth nodded, the reality of their situation sinking in. Then she said something that made Chaza go very still. They know who I am, she said. They put a bounty on me. He turned to look at her, his eyes trying to penetrate the gloom. What kind of bounty? $1,000, she said. Dead or alive? His eyes narrowed. This was more than just a posse. This was a manhunt. They think I'm just a scared girl running with her father's papers, she said, a new hard edge to her voice. But they're wrong. I know more than what's in this box. She set the wooden box on the floor. Then she reached down to the hem of her torn dress. Her fingers worked at the stitching, and from a hidden pocket sewn into the lining, she pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped parcel. Before the fires started, she said, my father gave this to me. He told me it was the real weapon. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was another smaller set of documents, letters with different seals, maps with different markings, and a stack of signed, sealed affidavits, testimonies from townsfolk, from merchants, even from a disgruntled army officer. It was never just about the water, Ruth explained, her voice low and intense. Lattimore's syndicate has been paying off Land Bureau judges for years. They even bribed an Army logistics officer to reroute supply wagons away from our region, trying to starve us out so we'd be forced to sell. Chaza let out a long, slow breath. This was bigger than he could have imagined. This wasn't just murder. It was a conspiracy that went all the way to the top. You weren't just the doctor's daughter, he said, looking at her with new eyes. You were his clerk, his archivist. She nodded. I filed his notes. I copied his letters. I made a record of every crooked deal, every threat, every lie. He saw her differently now, not as a victim, but as a warrior, a keeper of a truth so dangerous it had gotten an entire town erased from the map. These documents, he said, where were you taking them? To Santa Fe, she said. To Clara Beck. We were supposed to meet at the old mission. It's a 7-day ride from here, through the canyons. A 7-day ride through territory that was probably crawling with Lattimore's men. Before Chaza could reply, a voice boomed out of the darkness, making them both jump. Miss Calderon, we know you're in there. The voice was deep, laced with a cruel, confident drawl. Chaza's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Reuben Lattimore. In person. Send out the girl, Red Elk, and you can walk away from this, Lattimore shouted. We know who you are. The Army's favorite scout turned squatter. You don't owe this woman a thing. Chaza tightened his grip on his rifle. He thinks he knows me, he thought. Ruth stepped closer to him. If you want to give me up, she whispered, I won't blame you. He turned to her, his voice like flint. I've buried friends for less than what they did to your town, he growled, and I've watched too many good people die, while men like Lattimore get rich. Bang! A bullet slammed into the door, just inches from his head. Splinters exploded into the cabin. They're done talking, Chaza said, pulling her down to the floor. He crawled to the back of the cabin and lifted a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a dark, narrow opening. Root cellar, he explained. There's a tunnel. Leads out behind the old smokehouse. It'll buy you a minute, maybe two. Ruth shook her head. I'm not leaving you. It's not leaving if you're the one carrying the truth, he hissed. Another shout from outside. One more minute, Red Elk. Then we burn you out. Chazal looked around his small home, the blankets his grandmother had woven, the herbs his father had taught him to find, a lifetime of memories soaked into the wooden walls. This place was never meant to last forever, he said quietly. But the truth, maybe the truth has a chance. He handed her a leather satchel and quickly began stuffing the oilskin parcel inside, along with some dried meat and a full canteen. You know how to ride under fire? He asked. She gave a weak, terrified smile. Only in my nightmares. He almost smiled back. That'll have to do. Outside, the crunch of boots on dry earth grew louder. They were closing in. Chaza loaded his Winchester, tucked his hatchet into his belt, and looked at her one last time. Ready? Ruth nodded, the heavy revolver now steady in her hand. The cabin wouldn't hold, but their resolve would. The siege was about to begin. The attack came with a scream. One of Lattimore's men, trying to be clever, crept around the side of the cabin. What he didn't see was the thin horsehair tripwire Chaza had strung between two fence posts. The man's boot caught, and a cluster of empty glass bottles hanging from the roof beam came crashing down. The sound shattered the night. Before the gunman could even figure out what happened, Chaza fired. A single, clean shot through the window slit. The man's scream was cut short, and then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from all sides, tearing through the thin wooden walls of the cabin. Lead punched holes in the darkness, each one a fiery, angry eye. Ruth was pressed flat behind the overturned table, the Colt in her hand feeling impossibly heavy. She fired once, the recoil jarring her arm. She missed. She fired again. This time, a pained grunt from the darkness told her she'd found her mark. Lattimore's men tried to flank them, but this was Chaza's land. He knew every rock, every shadow. He had prepared for this. He lit and rolled out smoke bombs he'd made from pine pitch and wet sage. Thick, choking clouds of gray smoke billowed up, turning the moonlit yard into a ghostly, confusing hellscape. The raiders coughed and sputtered, their silhouettes appearing and disappearing in the fog like demons in a bad dream. Shaza moved through it all like a phantom. He was a whisper of motion, a blur of deadly force, a hatchet blow to a knee, the butt of his rifle to a jaw. He would strike and then melt back into the smoke before they could even return fire. Ruth crawled to the back window, trying to see, trying to help, and that's when she saw it. A flicker of movement by the barn, a tiny dancing flame, a fuse. "Chaza!" she screamed. "The barn!" It was too late. A deafening boom ripped the night in two. The old dry barn, soaked in kerosene, exploded in a massive ball of fire. The horses inside screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound of pure agony. The structure collapsed in on itself, sending a wave of heat and burning embers washing over the cabin. The flames shot 100 feet into the air, painting the sky a sickening orange and illuminating the entire yard in a hellish, flickering light. The force of the blast threw Ruth sideways. Her head slammed against the stone hearth. Pain exploded behind her eyes and her vision swam. "Ruth!" It was Chaza's voice, cutting through the ringing in her ears. He was pulling her back, away from the window, his hand on her face, checking her eyes. "Are you hit?" She shook her head, trying to clear it. "No, I'm fine." But when she tried to push herself up, a sharp, white-hot pain shot through her left shoulder. She looked down. A long, jagged splinter of wood from the window frame was sticking out of her arm. He saw it too. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the end of it and pulled. Ruth cried out, biting her lip to keep from screaming. Blood welled up, dark and hot. He ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt and began binding the wound, his movements quick and efficient. "You can still shoot with your other hand," he said, his voice grim. She gritted her teeth against the pain and picked up the revolver with her right hand. It felt awkward, clumsy, but she held it steady. The fire outside roared, a hungry beast devouring their only escape route. "They're boxing us in," Chaza growled, "burning away our options." From the darkness, Lattimore's voice called out again, smug and victorious. "Give it up, Red Elk! There's nowhere left to run." Ruth, fueled by pain and fury, crawled back to the window. "Neither can you, you murdering bastard!" she screamed, her voice raw. A bullet was her only answer. It slammed into the wall right next to her head, showering her face with dust and splinters. They were being penned. Chaza knew it. They had maybe minutes left before the raiders charged the cabin, or the fire from the barn spread to the roof. He scrambled to the hearth and pulled a loose stone away. From the cavity behind it, he took out a small leather pouch. Inside was a mixture of dried moss and iron shavings. An old Apache trick. He lit it with a spark from his flint and steel and tossed it out the window. It exploded in a shower of brilliant, blinding sparks, making two of the gunmen scream and stumble back, clutching at their eyes. It was the distraction he needed. He grabbed Ruth's good hand. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent. "We can't win this. Not here." She looked around the smoke-filled cabin, at the flames licking closer. She nodded. "I'll draw their fire," Chaza said. "Head east, towards the ravine. Make them think I'm trying to make a break for it." Ruth grabbed his arm. "You won't make it." "Neither will you if we stay together," he countered. Their eyes met in the flickering firelight. Two strangers, bound by a cause bigger than both of them. "There's a mule tethered behind the smokehouse," he said. "She's old, but she's quiet. Take her. Follow the creek bed north. Stay in the shadows. Don't stop for anything." Ruth hesitated. Then she did something unexpected. She pushed the heavy Colt revolver back into his hand. "I only have one good arm," she said. "You'll need this more than me." He shook his head, pushing it back to her. "No, you keep it. One bullet can change the whole story." Footsteps were pounding outside now, closer. They were getting ready for the final rush. Chaza leaned in, and for a moment that was both an eternity and no time at all, he pressed his forehead against hers. "For the truth," he whispered, "and for the dead." And then he was gone. He slipped out the back through the root cellar tunnel, a ghost vanishing into the smoke and chaos. Ruth counted to 30, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Then, clutching the satchel of documents, she ran for the front door. The longest night of her life had only just begun. Ruth burst out of the cabin, the heat from the burning barn hitting her like a physical blow. The air was thick with smoke, stinging her eyes and choking her lungs. She kept her head down and ran, a small, desperate figure darting through the chaos. The smokehouse was a dark shape against the roaring flames. She slipped behind it, her wounded shoulder screaming in protest. Just like Chaza had said, the old mule was there, stamping her feet nervously. With a surge of adrenaline, Ruth grabbed the reins and, using her good arm, hauled herself into the worn leather saddle. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, that strange, gray hour before the dawn. In the distance, she heard shouting, followed by a volley of gunshots. Chaza. He was drawing them off. He was buying her time. He moved through the trees like the spirit of vengeance, deliberately making noise, deliberately letting them see him. He didn't run straight. He zigzagged, using the yuccas and junipers for cover, leading them further and further away from the creek bed, further away from Ruth. "Come on, you yellow-bellied cowards," he yelled into the darkness. "You want to fight? Here I am." Two of Lattimore's men took the bait, charging after him, firing wildly into the shadows. A third man, however, paused. He looked towards the burning cabin, then towards the ravine where Chaza was headed. Then he turned and looked west, his eyes scanning the darkness. Towards the creek, towards Ruth. She felt it before she saw him, a prickling on the back of her neck, a cold knot of dread. She kicked the mule, urging the stubborn animal into a clumsy trot. She had to get to cover, the map her father had drawn. She remembered a detail, an old abandoned silver mine, carved into the side of the western ridge. Dangerous, he had marked it, collapsed tunnels. But right now, danger was her only hope. She scrambled off the mule halfway up the rocky slope and continued on foot, clutching the precious satchel. Her dress caught and tore on the thorny brush. Blood from her shoulder was soaking through the bandage now. She found the entrance to the mine hidden behind a curtain of dead vines. A blast of cold, stale air rushed out to meet her, smelling of damp earth and decay. But she didn't hesitate. She plunged into the blackness. The tunnel was narrow, the ground slick with loose gravel. She stumbled forward, one hand on the rough stone wall, the other holding the satchel tight. Back at the ravine, Chaza made his stand. He reached the edge of the deep canyon and turned, his rifle raised. He had one bullet left. He made it count. One of the gunmen went down, clutching his chest. Chaza dropped the empty rifle and drew his hatchet just as the second man charged him. He sidestepped, the man's momentum carrying him past, and brought the hatchet around in a vicious arc, burying it deep in the man's thigh. But he never saw the third man. It wasn't one of the two who had followed him. It was a different one, bigger. The butt of a rifle slammed into the back of Chaza's head with sickening force. The world exploded in a flash of white, and he crumpled to his knees, his vision blurring. Reuben Lattimore stepped out of the shadows, a cruel smile on his face. "Told you he'd come out to play," he said to the man beside him. "Red Elk always did have a flair for the dramatic." Blood was running down Chaza's face, but he managed a weak, defiant grin. "Didn't come for you, General," he rasped. "Just came to waste your time." Lattimore's boot connected with his ribs, hard. Chaza gasped, the air driven from his lungs. "Where is she?" Lattimore snarled, crouching down to look him in the eye. "Tell me where the girl is, or I'll start carving pieces off you until you do." Chaza met his gaze, his eyes full of hate. "You better start carving." Deep inside the mountain, Ruth stumbled out of the other end of the mine tunnel, blinking in the pale morning light. Below her, the creek shimmered, and there, grazing peacefully by the water's edge, was a horse. A big bay mare with a cavalry brand on her flank, abandoned in the chaos of the raid. Limping, bleeding, exhausted, Ruth made her way down to it. The horse shied away at first, but Ruth spoke to it in a low, soothing voice. She grabbed the reins with her bloody fingers and with a pained grunt, pulled herself into the saddle. "Easy, girl," she whispered. "We just have a little further to go." She nudged the horse north towards the trail to Santa Fe, and that's when a sharp whistle cut through the air. From across the canyon, Lattimore had seen her. "She's alive, Ra!" he roared. "Mount up!" The chase was on. The bay mare, remembering her training, galloped like the devil himself was on her tail. Ruth clung to her back, her body screaming in protest with every jolt. Behind her, she could hear the thunder of hoofbeats getting closer. Lattimore and his men. A bullet whizzed past her ear, so close she could feel the heat of it. She didn't look back. She just leaned forward, urging the horse on, tears of pain and desperation streaming from her eyes. They were closing the gap. Lattimore was a better rider, on a faster horse. He raised his pistol, took aim. Crack. The bullet didn't hit her. It hit the satchel. Papers, precious, irreplaceable papers, fluttered out and were scattered by the wind. "No!" she screamed, twisting to try and grab them. But they were gone. Lost. She cursed and clutched the damaged bag tighter. Some of the proof was gone, but not all of it. Not the most important parts. Not the oilskin parcel. She spurred the horse harder, pushing it up a steep, rocky ridge. The mare scrambled for purchase, her iron-shod hooves striking sparks from the stones. They reached the top, and for a moment, they were silhouetted against the rising sun. Below them lay the forests and canyons that led to Santa Fe. Freedom. She risked a glance back. Lattimore had stopped at the bottom of the ridge. He just sat on his horse watching her, his face a mask of black fury. He turned to his men. "Go get Red Elk," he snarled. "Bring him to me, alive." Chaza was dragged back to the ruins of his cabin. His arms were bound. His face was a swollen, bloody mess. Lattimore paced in front of him like a caged tiger. "You're going to talk," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "One way or another." Chaza spat a mouthful of blood and sand onto the dirt. "You think pain is new to me?" he sneered. "I've bled for better reasons than you'll ever know." A fist crashed into his jaw. He fell, but his eyes never lost their fire. And miles away, a wounded girl on a stolen horse rode north, carrying the last hope of a murdered town. The real fight had just begun. The journey to Santa Fe was a blur of pain and fear. Ruth rode for 8 days, pushing the stolen cavalry horse to its limits. She never stopped for more than a few hours, sleeping in ditches and caves, her hand always on the revolver Chaza had given her. The satchel of documents never left her side. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull, constant ache, but she ignored it. The pain was a reminder of Haven Crossing, a reminder of Chaza. She skirted towns and ranches, sticking to the wild country, drinking from streams and eating the last of the dried meat Chaza had packed. Every shadow looked like one of Lattimore's riders. Every snap of a twig made her heart leap into her throat, but she kept going. She had to. When she finally saw the adobe buildings of Santa Fe rising out of the desert, she almost cried with relief. It was early morning, the streets still quiet. She dismounted near the Central Plaza, in front of a modest building with a sign that read, New Mexican Chronicle. She was stiff, sore, and covered in a week's worth of trail dust, but she climbed the steps. Inside, a woman with sharp eyes and ink stains on her fingers looked up from a desk piled high with papers. "Clara Beck?" Ruth asked, her voice raspy from disuse. The woman stood. She was in her 40s with an air of tired but relentless determination. "You must be Ruth Calderon," she said. It wasn't a question. "He sent word you were coming." Ruth's heart skipped a beat. "He? Chaza? He's alive?" Clara gave a grim shake of her head. "No, not him. An old friend of your father's, a telegraph operator in Socorro. He said you were carrying the truth." Ruth felt a fresh wave of grief, but she pushed it down. There would be time for that later. She placed the tattered satchel on the desk. "These were my father's," she said. "They prove everything." Clara opened the bag with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Her sharp eyes scanned the documents, taking in the signed affidavits, the fraudulent land contracts, the letters implicating some of the most powerful men in the territory. "My God," she breathed. "This isn't just corruption. This is a shadow government." Ruth nodded, her face grim. "And they burned my town to keep it a secret." Clara Beck looked up, her eyes blazing with a fire that matched Ruth's own. "Then we," she said, "will print it in headlines a foot high." The first story hit the streets 2 weeks later. "The Water Syndicate, Blood and Lies in the New Mexico Desert." It was an explosion. The story spread like wildfire, picked up by papers in Denver, in St. Louis, in Washington, D.C. More headlines followed. "Haven Crossing Massacre, Survivor Testifies." Territorial officials implicated in massive land grab. The federal government, which usually ignored the territories, was forced to act. A special committee was formed, and Clara Beck and Ruth Calderon were summoned to testify. The hearing was a circus. Lawyers in expensive suits tried to paint Ruth as a hysterical, grieving girl making up wild stories. They questioned her character, her sanity. But she stood firm. Her voice shook, but it never broke, as she told the world what she had seen, what Reuben Lattimore had done. And then Clara Beck took the stand. She didn't give opinions. She just read from the documents, her voice clear and steady. She read the letters. She displayed the forged contracts. She named the names of the judges and officials who had taken Lattimore's blood money. When she was finished, the chamber was silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Reuben Lattimore was arrested 2 months after that, along with 3 of his cronies from the Territorial Land Office. The water syndicate collapsed. Its assets were seized. Its powerful members were disgraced. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But it was a hollow victory. It didn't bring back the people of Haven Crossing, and it didn't bring back Chaza. Ruth stayed in Santa Fe for a time, helping Clara write a book about the whole affair. The book became a sensation, a rallying cry for reform. The name Ruth Calderon became a symbol of courage. But the longer she stayed in the city, the more she felt like she was suffocating. This wasn't her world. One spring morning, almost a year to the day after the fire, she bought a horse and rode south. She didn't know what she was looking for. Penance, maybe, or just a quiet place to grieve. The land was the same. The sky was the same. But when she reached the place where Chaza's cabin had stood, there was nothing, just a black charred patch on the earth. Weeds were already growing up through the ashes. She dismounted and walked through the ruins, and there, half buried in the dirt where the front door used to be, she saw it, a glint of stone. She knelt and brushed away the dust. It was a pendant, carved from a smooth, dark river stone, an Apache symbol, the spiral sun, ringed with marks of fire and storm. Chaza's people carved them for warriors who fell in battle without a proper grave, a token left for the spirits, and for those who might come looking. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. She sat there in the ruins for hours until the sun began to set, painting the sky in the same shades of copper and blood as it had on that terrible night. There was no gravestone, no final words. Just this, a silent testament to a man who had died for a stranger, for a truth he believed in. She clutched the pendant to her chest, the stone cool against her skin. As she stood to leave, the wind picked up, whispering through the sagebrush. And in that sound, she could almost hear his voice. "Get inside, before it's too late." She had, and because of him, so had the truth. But the story doesn't end there. Because what Ruth didn't know was that justice is a patient hunter, and vengeance sometimes wears a badge. 2 weeks after Lattimore's arrest, a federal marshal named Jedediah Kane arrived in Santa Fe. He wasn't part of the tribunal. He was a quiet, grim-faced man who had been tracking Lattimore for years, for crimes that had nothing to do with water rights. He read the trial transcripts, listened to the testimonies, and then he went to see Lattimore in his jail cell. The guards let him in. They owed him favors. The conversation was short. When Marshal Kane left, Lattimore was still sitting on his cot, but the arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure animal terror. Because Kane hadn't come to talk about Haven Crossing. He'd come to talk about a payroll robbery during the war, a robbery that had ended with 3 Union soldiers, Kane's own men, being shot in the back. A robbery that had been pinned on an Apache scout, a scout named Chaza Red Elk. Lattimore had set him up. All those years ago, he'd stolen the gold, committed the murders, and then created a false trail that led right to Chaza. Chaza had escaped, but he'd been a wanted man ever since, living as a ghost on the edges of the world. His fight at the cabin wasn't just for Ruth. It was the last act of a man who had been wronged by the very people he had served. It all clicked into place. Lattimore's smug confidence, his casual cruelty. He thought he had buried his last secret. He was wrong. The next morning, as they were transporting Lattimore to the federal prison, his wagon was stopped on the road by a lone rider, Marshal Kane. He told the guards he had new orders, that Lattimore was being transferred to a military tribunal. It was a lie, of course, but the guards, intimidated by the cold-eyed marshal, believed him. They handed Lattimore over. Kane took Lattimore deep into the canyons, to the place where the chase for Ruth had ended. The place where Lattimore had last seen Chaza alive. He got him off his horse and pushed him towards the edge of a ravine. "This is for them," Kane said, his voice low and hard. "The men you murdered, and the man you framed." Lattimore, for the first time in his life, begged. He offered money, power, anything. Kane just shook his head. "Some things," he said, "can't be bought." He didn't shoot him. That would have been too easy. He just left him there. No horse, no water, 100 miles from anywhere. He gave him the same chance he had given Chaza's reputation. No chance at all. The desert took care of the rest. Ruth never knew the final details. She just heard months later that Reuben Lattimore had disappeared while being transported to prison. She went back to the land where Haven Crossing had once stood. She didn't try to rebuild the town. Some places are too full of ghosts. Instead, she used the money from her book to buy the land around the aquifer, putting it into a trust so no one could ever try to poison it again. She became a guardian of the water, a protector of the land. She never married, never left. She lived out her days in a small adobe house she built herself, not far from the ruins of Chaza's cabin. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was just right, she would sit on her porch, holding a smooth carved stone in her hand, and listen for the whispers of a ghost. A ghost who had taught her that some truths are worth dying for, and some people are worth fighting for. The world may have forgotten Haven Crossing, but the land remembers, and so does the water. And stories like this one, they're the reason we have to keep fighting. If this story of justice in the Old West moved you, and you want to hear more tales of forgotten heroes and villains who got what they deserved, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Thanks for listening.